"You locked him in here," the girl said, staring at the sealed room, but when they break down the door, they find something terrifying. Let me know what you thought of this story with a rating from 0 to 10 and comment what city you're watching from. I really want to know if you like my story and get to know you better, so please subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The auctioneer's gavel struck the oak table of the old Blackwood Manor 3 times, its sound echoing off the century-old walls like a final farewell. Arthur Blackwood, 52, adjusted his Italian tie as he watched the last interested parties leave the main hall. His grey eyes swept one last time over the architectural details he had learned to ignore during decades of mandatory childhood visits. The property on Violet Lane in Crestwood, Vermont, would finally be sold next week, thus severing the last link that connected him to his family's painful memories. As a real estate magnate, Arthur had built an empire based on the calculated coldness of business. His company, Blackwood Holdings, had dominated the Vermont market for over 2 decades, and his reputation as an inflexible man in contracts was known throughout the state. He never got emotionally involved with the properties he dealt with. For him, houses were just products, bricks and numbers that generated substantial profits. Blackwood Manor, an unwanted inheritance from his father who had died 3 years earlier, would be treated the same way. No sentimentality, no nostalgic glances, just another profitable business transaction. Monday morning arrived heavy with the characteristic humidity of the Green Mountains. Arthur drove his black BMW to the house on Violet Lane, accompanied by his executive briefcase and an iron will to finalize the last preparations before the transfer of ownership. He had hired a specialized cleaning crew to leave the property impeccable for the new owners, a retired couple from Boston who planned to turn the century-old building into a romantic inn. Carmen Hayes, 38, arrived promptly at 8 in the morning with her team of 3. She was a woman of medium height, with brown hair tied back in a practical ponytail, and calloused hands that told the story of a life dedicated to hard work. A widow for 2 years, she supported her young daughter with the residential cleaning services she provided in the region. Her company, modest but efficient, had built a solid reputation among the most demanding clientele in Crestwood. Carmen greeted Mr. Blackwood respectfully, holding the small hand of a curly-haired girl hiding shyly behind her legs. She introduced the girl as her daughter Jade and explained that she hoped he wouldn't mind her presence, as school was on holiday and she had no one to leave her with. Arthur lowered his eyes to the 4-year-old child who was observing him with childlike curiosity, her brown eyes shining with a liveliness that contrasted with the seriousness of the environment. For a fraction of a second, something strange stirred in his chest, an uncomfortable feeling he quickly dismissed with an impatient wave of his hand. He replied dryly that it was fine as long as she didn't get in the way of the work. Turning his attention back to the documents he was carrying, he wanted everything finished today, as the house needed to be ready for the buyer's final inspection tomorrow. Carmen nodded, accustomed to the coldness of wealthy clients. She had worked in dozens of mansions where she was treated like furniture, ignored by owners who barely acknowledged her existence. Arthur Blackwood seemed to fit this pattern perfectly, a rich, distant man concerned only with efficiency and results. Jade, on the other hand, showed no intimidation in the face of Arthur's imposing presence. While her mother organized the cleaning equipment at the entrance, the girl began to explore the house's corridors with the natural curiosity of children. Her small footsteps echoed on the waxed wooden floor, and she murmured quietly to herself, creating imaginary narratives about each room she discovered. Blackwood Manor was a labyrinth of architectural memories. Built at the turn of the last century, it retained features typical of New England's Gilded Age: high ceilings, large windows with wooden shutters, Portuguese tiles in the kitchen, and an inner garden that was once magnificent but now grew wild and neglected. The furniture had been removed the previous week, leaving only marks on the floor and lighter patches on the walls where paintings used to hang. Arthur walked through the rooms with Carmen, explaining in detail his requirements for the cleaning. Every word he spoke was measured, professional, devoid of any affection for the property that had housed his childhood. For him, those walls did not hold precious memories of family Christmases or happy birthdays. They only held the painful memory of a twin brother who had mysteriously disappeared when they were both 8 years old. Oliver. The name Arthur had learned not to say, not to think, not to remember. His twin brother had simply vanished one winter morning, leaving only conflicting theories and a heavy silence that settled over the Blackwood family forever. The official version, told by his parents to neighbors and acquaintances, was that the boy had gone to live with distant relatives in another state due to health problems. But Arthur had always known there was something deeply wrong with that story. While the adults discussed schedules and cleaning procedures, Jade continued her solitary exploration of the house. There was something in the atmosphere of the place that sparked her imagination. The long corridors seemed to whisper ancient stories, and the windows framed landscapes that changed color as the clouds moved over the distant mountains. It was upon reaching the end of the back corridor that Jade discovered a door different from the others. It was a dark wooden door with an old, ornate lock that immediately caught her attention. The girl tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She pressed her ear against the wood, as if she could hear secrets from the other side. Jade's voice echoed down the hall as she called for her mother, telling her there was a locked room here. Carmen appeared at the end of the corridor, closely followed by Arthur. The businessman's face paled when he saw the cleaning lady's daughter standing before that specific door. It was the back room, the place he had avoided his entire adult life, the room his parents had always kept locked with a vague explanation about structural and problems. Carmen extended her hand to her daughter, telling her to come here and not to touch things that weren't hers, but the girl protested that she wanted to see what was inside, her childlike curiosity overriding her obedience. It looked like a magical room, she said. Arthur approached the door, feeling a strange chill run up his spine. He hadn't set foot in that corridor for decades, had avoided anything related to that part of the house for decades. The lock was exactly as he remembered it from his childhood, a piece of wrought iron with details that looked like intertwined flowers. He said it was just an empty room, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. It probably had damp problems. There was nothing interesting in there. Jade looked at him with that sharp perception children sometimes show, as if she could see through the adult's words to the hidden truths. But why was it locked if there was nothing in it, she asked. The question hung in the stuffy air of the corridor, and Arthur realized he didn't have a convincing answer. In fact, he had never questioned his parents about that locked door. He had simply accepted the explanation that it was a room with structural problems and never brought it up again. Carmen, sensing the tension that had set in, took her daughter's hand firmly. She told Jade that was enough questions and that it was time to get to work. But as they turned to leave the corridor, something unexpected happened. Jade tripped on a loose floorboard and, trying to steady herself against the wall, accidentally pushed a wooden panel that gave way with a dry click. It was an old mechanism, probably installed decades ago, that worked as an additional lock. The sound echoed through the corridor like a gunshot, followed by a tense silence. Then, slowly, the door to the back room creaked open a few inches, revealing only darkness on the other side. Arthur felt the world spin. For nearly half a century, that door had remained hermetically sealed, and now, because of a child's accident, it was open for the first time in his conscious memory. Jade regained her balance and looked fascinated at the dark slit that had opened before her. She exclaimed to her mother that she had managed to open it, but before either of the adults could react, the girl took 2 steps into the dark room, and it was at that exact moment that the nightmare began. There was a distinctive metallic click, followed by the sound of locks automatically engaging. Jade had just been trapped in the back room of Blackwood Manor, and the door that had miraculously opened was now sealed again, this time with the child on the other side. The cry of despair that erupted from Carmen's throat echoed through Blackwood Manor like an ancient lament, awakening forgotten echoes in the century-old walls. She threw herself against the wooden door, pushing, pulling, trying to force the old lock that had swallowed her daughter like a hungry mouth. Her hands trembled violently as she pounded on the dark wood, calling Jade's name with an anguish that tore through the morning air. She cried out for Jade, her daughter, asking if she was okay, pleading for her to answer. Carmen's voice broke with each word, interspersed with sobs she tried unsuccessfully to control. From the other side of the door, the small, frightened voice of the 4-year-old girl came, muffled but clear enough for both adults to feel their hearts shatter. Jade cried that she couldn't get out, that the door wouldn't open. She beat her little hands against the wood, and the faint sound of childish fists against the solid surface heightened everyone's despair. She was scared, she said, because it was so dark. Arthur remained paralyzed for a few seconds, watching the horror scene unfold before his eyes. The child who moments before was exploring the house with innocent curiosity was now trapped in the exact place he had avoided his entire adult life. It was as if the past had resurfaced from the depths of his repressed memories to collect a debt he didn't even know he owed. Carmen turned to Arthur, her eyes red with tears and an expression that mixed fear and outrage, asking how long this door had been locked. How could such a lock still work, she demanded, and why hadn't he warned her about the danger? Arthur swallowed hard, feeling the weight of decades of neglect and escape fall upon his shoulders like an avalanche. He confessed that he didn't know it worked like that he'd never seen the door open. His parents had always said there were structural problems, that it was dangerous to enter. Carmen stepped closer to him with a fury that made her eyes shine dangerously, questioning his definition of dangerous. She accused him of bringing a child into a house with deadly traps and not thinking it was important to mention it. From inside the locked room, Jade's voice sounded again, this time calmer, as if the child was adapting to the situation with the natural resilience of childhood. She told her mother there was a man in here with her. The silence that followed was so profound that Arthur could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Carmen turned pale, and her voice came out as a hoarse whisper. She asked what Jade meant, questioning if her daughter was just making things up because she was scared. Jade insisted that she wasn't. The man was sitting in the corner, near the window, she explained. He was very sad and didn't talk to her, but he had waved when she said hi. Jade's voice sounded too serene for a 4-year-old who had just been trapped in a dark room with a stranger. She added that his hair was just like the nice man's who was outside with her. Mom. Arthur felt the world collapse around him. His legs gave way, and he had to lean against the wall to keep from falling, hair just like his. Carmen looked at him with a growing sense of panic, beginning to understand that something much more complex and disturbing was happening. Carmen forced her voice to sound calm, asking Jade to listen to her carefully. She asked if Jade was sure there was someone in there with her, if it wasn't too dark to see. The girl replied that there was a small window that let in a little light, and that he was right beside her now. He wanted her to tell the man outside that he never forgot about the paper birds they used to make together. The impact of that revelation was like a punch to Arthur's stomach. Paper birds. He and Oliver used to make colorful paper birds on rainy afternoons, hiding them around the house as a secret game between brothers. It was a memory so intimate, so specific, that only someone who had lived those moments could know it. Arthur murmured that it was impossible. Oliver had disappeared 44 years ago. He had left, gone, to live with distant relatives. Carmen turned to him abruptly, her maternal instincts overriding her fear and confusion. She demanded to know who Oliver was, what he was talking about. Her daughter was trapped in there with a stranger, and he was delirious about someone who had vanished decades ago. Before Arthur could answer, Jade's voice echoed again, this time carrying a wisdom that didn't seem to belong to a child her age. She relayed that the sad man said he never left. He had always lived here in the hidden room. He said his daddy had told him to stay here because the people outside wouldn't understand that he was different. The girl's words fell like bombs in the tense silence of the corridor. Arthur slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his head buried in his hands. Pieces of memories began to reorganize in his mind, like a sinister puzzle finally finding its missing pieces. Oliver had always been different. Slower to speak, slower to understand simple instructions, more attached to routines and rituals than was normal for a child. In the 1980s, in a traditional Vermont family, having a child with an intellectual disability was considered a shame to be hidden from society. Arthur whispered, "My God," the pieces of the puzzle fitting together with devastating clarity. They hadn't sent him away. They had hidden him here. His parents had kept his brother a prisoner in this room for all these years. Carmen knelt before him, gripping his shoulders tightly. She told Arthur he needed to focus. If there was really someone in there with her daughter, they needed to call the police immediately. Arthur's response was louder than he intended as he shouted no. He explained they couldn't involve the police yet. If Oliver was truly alive, if he had spent all these decades locked away, one could only imagine the trauma he must have. The presence of strangers could frighten him even more. From inside the room, Jade spoke again, her voice echoing strangely, as if she were repeating words someone had whispered to her. The sad man said he had taken care of the paper birds all these years. He had kept them in a small box under the window, waiting for his brother to come back and play. Carmen closed her eyes, trying to process the surreal situation unfolding. Around her, her daughter was trapped in a room with a man who could be dangerous, unstable, traumatized by decades of forced isolation. And the owner of the house seemed to be having a nervous breakdown upon discovering his family had committed a heinous crime against his own brother. She said they had to find a way to open this door, returning her attention to the old lock. There must be a key somewhere in the house, she reasoned, asking if he remembered where his parents kept the keys. Arthur slowly raised his head, his glazed eyes gradually focusing on Carmen's worried face. He remembered his father always carried a bunch of old keys in his pocket. When he died, Arthur found the keys with his other belongings, but never knew what they were for. He told her the keys were at his apartment in Boston, in a desk drawer. He stood up unsteadily, running his hands over his face. That was almost a 2-hour drive, he lamented, too long to leave her daughter trapped in there. At that moment, something unexpected happened. Jade's voice sounded different, more mature, as if she were channeling someone else's words. The sad man said the key was here in the house. He said it was in the place where the two brothers used to hide their secret treasures. A shiver ran down Arthur's spine. He and Oliver had a secret hiding place when they were children. A hole in the basement wall, behind a pile of loose bricks, where they kept their small discoveries and childhood treasures, colorful stones, old coins found in the garden, small broken toys they fixed together. The basement, he whispered. They had to go to the basement. Carmen followed him down the narrow stairs that led to the sub-level of Blackwood Manor. The air was damp and poorly lit, smelling of mold and years of neglect. Arthur turned on his phone's flashlight and aimed the beam at the corner where the old pile of bricks was. The bricks were still there, covered in decades of dust and spider webs. With trembling hands, Arthur began to remove them one by one until he revealed a small niche in the wall. Inside, wrapped in a cloth deteriorated by time, was a small rusted metal box. He said there was something here, carefully removing the box from its hiding place. The lock was corroded, but it still worked. With some effort, he managed to open it. Inside the box, along with some children's toys and yellowed papers, was an ornate key that exactly matched the design of the lock on the back room door. But there was something else that made Arthur's heart stop. Dozens of small paper birds, carefully folded and preserved, some already yellowed with time. Carmen watched as tears welled up in Arthur's eyes as he delicately touched the paper birds. He murmured that Oliver had kept all their games, that he had kept their childhood alive all these years. They ran up the stairs, the key clutched in Arthur's hand, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. When they reached the back corridor, he inserted the key into the old lock, with hands that trembled so much he could barely find the keyhole. The lock gave way with a soft click, and the door opened slowly, revealing a small but organized room, lit by a high window that filtered the golden afternoon light. Jade was sitting on the floor, next to a figure that made time stop for Arthur. Oliver Blackwood, now a 52-year-old man, but with the innocent, frightened eyes of an eternal child, was there, real and alive, after 4 decades of isolation. His hair was grey, his face prematurely aged by confinement, but his eyes were exactly the same as the ones Arthur saw in the mirror every morning. The two brothers stared at each other across lost time, and Arthur understood that his life had just changed forever. The silence that settled in the back room was as dense as the mist that descended from the Green Mountains on winter mornings. Arthur remained on the threshold, unable to take a single step, as his eyes traced every detail on the face of the brother he had believed lost forever. Oliver, in turn, shrank against the wall, his hands trembling violently at the sight of a figure that had existed only in his fragmented memories for decades. Jade broke the tense moment with the disconcerting naturalness of children. She told her mother that the sad man was crying, pointing to Oliver, who indeed had tears streaming silently down his aged face. He had said, she relayed, that he was afraid his brother had forgotten they were best friends. Carmen, carefully, entered the room and knelt beside her daughter, wrapping her in a protective hug as she watched the devastating scene unfold. The environment revealed decades of a life lived in total isolation. There was a simple bed, a small table covered in childish drawings, and the walls were decorated with hundreds of paper birds hanging from strings, an origami forest that transformed the small space into a kind of sanctuary of memory. Arthur finally found his voice and whispered Oliver's name. "It's me," he said. "Arthur, your brother." The middle-aged man with the mind of a child slowly looked up, and a shy, broken smile formed on his lips. He called him Artie, the childhood nickname only he had ever used. "You came back," he said. "I saved all our birds. Look." Oliver rose with careful movements and went to a wooden box in the corner of the room. With hands trembling with emotion, he opened it to reveal hundreds of colorful origami, some so old the paper had yellowed, others more recent, made from magazine pages and newspapers someone must have brought him over the years. He continued in a touchingly innocent voice that he had made a new one. "Every week, Dad said you would come back when I had 1,000 birds. I already have 986. He paused, counting mentally, then added that he needed to make 14 more. The revelation struck Arthur like lightning. His father had used the promise of his brother's return as a cruel way to keep Oliver occupied and hopeful during decades of confinement. It was a calculated lie that had turned fraternal love into an instrument of control and manipulation. Carmen watched the interaction with a mixture of fascination and horror. As a mother, she felt a deep outrage at the cruelty this man had suffered, held prisoner by his own family for his entire adult life. As a human being, she was witnessing a reunion that defied her understanding of the limits of human evil. Arthur approached slowly, telling Oliver that their father had passed away 3 years ago and their mother had been gone for a long time too. Oliver's face contorted in a painful confusion. He said, but Dad had told him it was just until he got better. He said he was sick and that people outside would be afraid of him. Arthur's voice broke with emotion as he replied that Oliver was never sick, brother. You were always perfect just the way you are. Dad was the one who was wrong. At that moment, Jade freed herself from her mother's arms and approached Oliver with the innocent courage of children. She asked if he wanted to make a paper bird with her, explaining that her grandma Rose had taught her before she went to heaven. Oliver smiled for the first time since the door had opened, a genuine smile that lit up his entire face. He asked if she knew how to make paper birds just like his. The girl nodded enthusiastically and sat on the floor beside him. Carmen's heart ached as she saw her daughter at only 4 years old, showing more compassion and acceptance than many adults would be capable of. While Jade and Oliver worked together folding paper, Arthur explored the rest of the room with eyes that recorded every detail as evidence of a heinous crime. There were notebooks filled with childish drawings, homemade calendars where Oliver marked the days with small strokes, and a pile of children's books so well read their covers were faded. On one of the walls, he discovered something that made him stagger, a height chart marked in pencil with dates noted beside it. Someone had measured Oliver's growth over the years, just as loving parents do with their children. The markings went from childhood until a few years ago, revealing that his brother had received some kind of care, even in captivity. Arthur turned his attention back to Oliver, asking who brought him food, who took care of him all these years. Oliver stopped folding the paper for a moment, his face contracting in concentration. He said, Mrs. Eleanor came every day. She brought food and new books. Sometimes when Dad wasn't here, she would let him go out into the back garden. Carmen moved closer, intrigued. She asked if he meant Mrs. Eleanor Vance. Oliver nodded vigorously. You know Grandma Eleanor? He asked. She is very good to me. She said my grandmother was a lot like me when she was young. Carmen's world seemed to spin. Mrs. Eleanor Vance was her grandmother, a woman who had worked as a housekeeper in family homes her entire life. Her grandmother had always spoken of a wealthy family she had worked for many years, a family that had dark secrets involving a special child. Carmen had always thought they were just old-age stories, exaggerations from a woman who liked to dramatize her memories. My grandmother worked for your family, Carmen said to Arthur, the pieces of a generational puzzle fitting together in her mind. She always said she had left a job because she couldn't live with the injustice she witnessed, but she never gave details. Arthur felt the weight of another devastating revelation. Carmen's grandmother had been an unwitting accomplice to his family's crime, forced to care for Oliver in secret to keep her source of income. How many people had known about his brother's existence over the years? How many had been forced to remain silent out of fear or necessity? Oliver continued, his voice turning sad, that Mrs. Eleanor had stopped coming 3 months ago. She said she was very tired and that soon someone would come to take him to a new house. 3 months. Exactly the time that had passed since Arthur had decided to sell the property. Mrs. Eleanor, then over 80, had understood that Oliver's secret care would end with the sale of the house, and had taken some measures to protect him. Carmen asked, concerned, where he got food after she stopped coming. Oliver pointed to a corner of the room where there were some cans of preserves and packages of crackers. She left a lot of food stored, he explained, and I learned to save it because I didn't know when someone would come back. The image of Oliver rationing food to survive for the last 3 months, alone and abandoned, was the last blow Arthur could bear. He sat heavily on the bed, covering his face with his hands as he sobbed in a way he hadn't since childhood. Jade dropped the origami she was making and approached Arthur with the sharp, emotional perception of children. She told him not to cry, using the affectionate term Uncle Arthur that had come naturally. Oliver isn't alone anymore, she said. Now he has you again, and I can be his friend too. Oliver smiled at the girl and then looked at his brother with a cautious expression of hope. Artie, are you going to take me to see the world outside now? He asked. Mrs. Eleanor said it's very beautiful. Arthur raised his head, his red eyes fixing on his brother's face. For 44 years, he had lived with the guilt of having lost Oliver, built an entire life based on emotional coldness to protect himself from the pain of that loss. Now he discovered that the loss had been a lie, that his brother had spent decades waiting for a reunion that never came. Yes, brother, he said, his voice firm for the first time since entering that room. I'm going to show you a whole world that's waiting for you. Carmen watched the transformation in Arthur, seeing the cold, calculating man give way to a brother desperate to make up for decades of involuntary absence. But a practical concern began to grow in her mind. How would a man who had lived in isolation for 44 years adapt to the outside world? She said gently to Arthur that they needed to think carefully about how to make this transition. Oliver would need specialized support, medical follow-up, and time to adapt gradually. But Arthur was beyond rationality. He stood up abruptly and extended a hand to his brother. He asked Oliver if he wanted to come with him now. He wanted to show him his house, his office, the mountains, everything. Oliver hesitated, looking around the room that had been his only reality for decades. He asked about his birds, if they would come too. All of them, Arthur promised. We'll take every single one of your birds. It was in this moment of euphoria and reunion that Carmen noticed something the brothers, lost in their emotions, had not. Jade had become very quiet, observing the interaction between the adults with a worried expression. When Carmen approached her daughter, the girl whispered something that would completely change the course of the story. She told her mother that Oliver was happy now, but he was very afraid to leave. He had told her that he tried to leave once, when he was younger, but he got so scared of the outside world that he fainted. He said people are too loud and scary. The harsh, complex reality of the situation finally imposed itself on the euphoria of the moment. Oliver was not just a man who had been kept in captivity. He had become psychologically dependent on that confinement, developing defense mechanisms that turned the outside world into a terrifying threat. 6 months had passed since that transformative afternoon at Blackwood Manor, and the autumn of 2024 arrived in Crestwood, painting the mountains in golden hues that mirrored the new reality of all the lives involved in that devastating discovery. Arthur's apartment in Boston had been abandoned, replaced by a single-story house on the outskirts of the historic town, specially adapted to welcome Oliver with all the patience and care that 44 years of confinement required. The transition had not been easy. In the first days after the reunion, Oliver had gone into a state of panic every time they tried to take him out of the back room. His hands trembled uncontrollably, his breathing became irregular, and he would curl up in a fetal position whenever he heard noises from the outside world. Dr. Helen Carter, a psychiatrist specializing in severe trauma, had explained to Arthur that decades of isolation had created a profound agoraphobia, and that reintegration would be a long and delicate process. Carmen had become much more than an occasional employee. During those months of adaptation, she and Jade became the family Oliver never had the chance to know. The girl, with her natural acceptance and genuine affection, could calm Oliver in a way that not even Arthur could. Jade had become the bridge between the complex adult world and the childlike mind that inhabited Oliver's aged body. One sunny morning in May, Jade held the middle-aged man's trembling hand and told Uncle Oliver that today they would just go to the gate, just to see the flowers that had bloomed yesterday. Oliver nodded nervously, trusting the child in a way he couldn't trust adults. Step by step, day by day, Jade had guided his adaptation to the outside world, respecting his limits and celebrating each small victory as if it were a monumental achievement. Arthur watched the scene from the window of his new house, feeling a mixture of gratitude and guilt that had become his constant companion. In recent months, he had liquidated much of his business to devote himself entirely to his brother's care, discovering in the process that his entire pursuit of financial success had been a desperate attempt to fill the void left by Oliver's absence. The investigation into his parents' crimes had revealed a network of silence and complicity that extended far beyond what Arthur had imagined. Mrs. Vance, found in a nursing home in New York, where she lived under a granddaughter's care, had confirmed the sordid details of the story. During a painful but necessary conversation, the elderly woman revealed that she had been blackmailed for decades by Arthur's father, forced to care for Oliver in secret under the threat of losing not only her job, but also the house where she lived with her family. She had told him with a weak but still indignant voice that his father had discovered her husband had stolen some tools from the construction site where he worked. He said that if she didn't take care of the boy, he would have her Antonio arrested. She had no choice. The revelation had shattered the last illusions Arthur held about the Blackwood family. His father was not just a man who had hidden a disabled son out of social shame. He was a criminal who had used blackmail and coercion to keep his monstrosity a secret, destroying other lives in the process. Carmen had discovered through Mrs. Vance that her own grandmother, who had died years earlier, had carried a deep guilt until the end of her life. Rose Vance had repeatedly tried to convince her employers to treat Oliver with dignity, even threatening to report the situation to the authorities. She was summarily fired and threatened with death if she ever revealed what she knew. Carmen had told Arthur one rainy afternoon that her grandmother had died thinking she was a coward for not saving that boy. She didn't know that her own daughter was being used by the same man to keep the crime going. The discovery had created a connection between Carmen and Arthur that went far beyond the circumstances that brought them together. Both carried deep family wounds. Both had lost fundamental pieces of their personal histories because of the Blackwood family's crimes. The difference was that Carmen had built her life on strength and determination, while Arthur had lost himself in the emotional coldness he had used as a shield against pain. During those months of living together, something unexpected blossomed between them. It was not just the gratitude of a rich man for a woman who had helped him find his brother, nor just the understanding of a mother for the resources he offered to care for Jade. It was a genuine love built on solid foundations of mutual respect and shared purpose. One June evening, as they watched Jade teach Oliver to draw stars on paper, Arthur told Carmen that he wanted to make their situation official. She asked what situation, though a smile formed on her lips. "Our family," he replied simply. He wanted her and Jade to come live here permanently. He wanted to officially adopt Jade if she would allow it. And he wanted them to get married. Carmen was silent for a moment, watching her daughter, who had become the guardian angel of a traumatized man, and who in return had gained an adoring uncle and an adoptive father who offered stability and unconditional love. She asked Arthur if he was sure this was what he wanted, if it wasn't just gratitude or a moral obligation. He held her hands, looking directly into her eyes. He explained that for 52 years he had lived as if his life were only about accumulating assets and keeping a safe distance from anything that could hurt him. The three of them had taught him that real life is about connection, care, family. It's about being present for the people we love. The answer came a few days later when Carmen found Arthur in the office. He had transformed into a studio for Oliver. Hundreds of colorful origami decorated the walls, and his brother was concentrating on a new creation, humming a song Jade had taught him. She simply said the answer was yes, but with one condition. Anything, he replied. She wanted them to turn Blackwood Manor into a home for special needs children. She wanted the pain their families had suffered to be transformed into hope for other families. Arthur smiled, recognizing in her the moral strength that had been lacking in the Blackwoods for generations. He said he had already started thinking about it and had been talking to social workers about the region's needs. The wedding ceremony took place in September in a flowery garden at the new house, with Oliver as best man and Jade as the flower girl. The event brought together only a few people: Dr. Carter, some of Arthur's loyal employees, and neighbors who had become friends during the months of adaptation. Mrs. Vance, brought specially from New York, sat in the front row, crying with emotion to see that her silent dedication had resulted in something beautiful. The most touching moment of the ceremony was when Oliver, overcoming his shyness, approached the microphone to give a speech no one expected. He said with a trembling but determined voice that his brother Artie had been away for a long time. But he came back and brought a new family for them. Carmen takes care of him like Grandma Eleanor did, and Jade taught him that the world outside has beautiful colors he didn't know. He paused, looking at the emotional faces of the small audience. "Now I'm not afraid to leave the room anymore," he continued, "because I know I'll always have a place to come back to. And when I make my 1,000th paper bird, I'm going to give it to Jade, because she was the one who taught me that real birds aren't kept in cages." 2 years later, Blackwood Manor reopened as Hope House, an institution specializing in the care of children with special needs whose families couldn't provide adequate support. Arthur had invested his entire fortune in the project, creating an environment where no child would be hidden, rejected, or abandoned for being different. Oliver had become a sort of mascot for the home, always present to welcome new children with his infinite patience and colorful origami. His story, carefully adapted not to traumatize the little ones, served as an inspiration that there was always hope, even in the darkest moments. Jade, now 7, was officially Jade Vance Blackwood, and had developed a special talent for helping traumatized children adapt to the welcoming environment of the home. Her natural gift for seeing beyond appearances and connecting with wounded people had transformed into a calling that promised to impact many lives in the future. On a golden December afternoon, while watching Jade teach a group of children to make origami under Oliver's patient guidance, Arthur reflected on the extraordinary journey that had taken him from that cold morning when he planned to sell Blackwood Manor to this moment of family fulfillment. Carmen approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. She asked what he was thinking about. He replied that he was thinking about how a locked door can change everything. If Jade hadn't been trapped in that room, if it weren't for her courage to enter an unknown house, if it weren't for his compassion for a child in danger, if, she interrupted with a smile, life isn't made of ifs, Arthur. It's made of choices, and you chose to do the right thing when you discovered the truth. We chose, he corrected, pulling her closer. We chose to build something beautiful on the ruins of what came before. In the distance, Oliver laughed with the children as a particularly complicated origami took shape in his experienced hands. It was the most beautiful sound Arthur had ever heard. The laughter of a man who had finally discovered that the world was not a scary place, but a place full of possibilities for those who have the courage to open the right doors. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story with a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.